Sometimes history's silence says more than its records. The year is 1595. The Ottoman Empire is at its absolute peak, the most powerful Islamic empire on earth, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean, inside the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, the most powerful city in the world. Something unspeakable is happening. Murad III has just died, and before his body is even cold, before the morning drums have stopped echoing off the marble walls, his son Mehmed ascends the throne. But becoming Sultan is not just a coronation, it is a sentence. In the hours that follow, 19 young princes are located, one by one, throughout the palace. Some are sleeping, some are pulled from their mother's arms, screaming. They are brought before the executioners, royal mutes trained specifically for this task, and strangled with silk cords. Silk, because royal blood could not be shed. 19 brothers, one night. And Mehmed III didn't even flinch. This is not a crime story. This is Ottoman law. To understand how an empire reaches a point where a sultan can legally execute his own brothers on the day he takes power, you have to understand what the Ottoman Empire was built on. Power. Absolute, uncompromising, terrifying power. The Ottomans didn't just conquer land. They conquered the idea that any individual, no matter who, was more important than the stability of the empire itself. That included brothers, that included fathers, that included sons. And in a dynasty where polygamy meant a sultan could father dozens of children from multiple concubines, every succession became a potential civil war waiting to happen. Think about it. A sultan dies. He has 15 sons from 7 different mothers. Each mother is fiercely loyal to her own child. Each prince has supporters, generals who backed them, governors who funded them, janissary commanders who pledged them loyalty. The moment the sultan's eyes close, the empire doesn't mourn, it fractures. Every faction picks a side. Armies march, blood flows. The Ottomans had seen this happen. They had lived through it. In the early days of the empire, the period historians call the interregnum, the years between 1402 and 1413-4, sons of Sultan Bayezid I tore the empire apart in a decade-long civil war after their father was humiliated and captured by Timur. The empire nearly ceased to exist. Cities burned, alliances shattered, borders collapsed. An empire that had spent a century expanding nearly vanished in 11 years of brotherly warfare. That trauma never left the Ottoman consciousness, and one man decided to solve it permanently. Mehmed II, the Conqueror, the man who took Constantinople in 1453 and made the world tremble. Most people know him as a military genius. What fewer people talk about is that Mehmed II was also a ruthless political architect, a man who understood that empires are not destroyed only by swords, but by succession crises. Shortly after consolidating his power, Mehmed III did something unprecedented in the history of Islamic governance. He wrote it into law. Into his imperial Kanun, his book of laws, Mehmed included a chilling clause that would echo through Ottoman history for over a century. The clause essentially stated, whichever of my sons inherits the sultanate, it is permissible for him to kill his brothers for the sake of the world order. Read that again. A sultan, a caliph, a man who was theoretically both a political ruler and a religious authority, legally sanctioned the murder of his own children to preserve the throne. And he justified it with a famous line, one that historians have wrestled with for centuries. The majority of scholars have approved this action. Let him who becomes sultan act accordingly. This was not a mad king making a rash decision in a fit of paranoia. This was cold, calculated, systemized violence, institutionalized fratricide, dressed in the language of Islamic jurisprudence and imperial necessity. Mehmed II himself had opened this path by ordering the execution of his infant half-brother Ahmed when he first came to power. He knew what unchecked succession looked like. He had seen what happened to Bayezid's empire, and he was determined it would never happen to his. The law was now written. The empire would follow it for generations. Act 3. The golden cage and the psychology of waiting to die. Here is where the story becomes deeply disturbing psychological. For the princes who were not chosen as Sultan, the younger brothers, the half-brothers, the sons of lesser concubines, life inside the Ottoman palace was not luxury. It was a sentence with an unknown execution date. They lived in a section of the Topkapi palace called the Kafes, the cage. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that somewhere in the palace your brother is Sultan, and that the moment he dies, whoever replaces him has the legal right and the political obligation to have you killed. You eat, you sleep, you breathe, but you are, in every meaningful sense, already a dead man. The Kafes wasn't always walls and locks in the earlier period. Princes were sent to govern provinces to gain experience. But that practice itself was dangerous because a prince with an army and a loyal population was a prince who could launch a rebellion. So gradually, the system evolved. Princes were kept inside the palace, educated, yes, fed, yes, given concubines, but deliberately given concubines who were past childbearing age or reportedly made sterile so that no heir to an heir could be born in secret. The empire was quite literally preventing its own bloodline from reproducing, all in service of control. Psychologically, what does this do to a person? The historical accounts and court records that survive paint a picture of princes who existed in a state of suspended terror, some going mad with anxiety, some becoming deeply pious and fatalistic, some descending into alcoholism and numbness. The 17th century Ottoman Sultan Ibrahim, later known as Ibrahim the Mad, spent years inside the cafes watching his brothers get executed one by one before him, convinced every footstep outside his door was an executioner coming for him. By the time he actually became Sultan, the isolation and psychological trauma had so thoroughly fractured his mind that he was almost incapable of ruling. The cafes didn't just contain princes, it consumed them. But nothing in Ottoman history illustrates the horror of this system more vividly than what happened on the night Mehmed III took the throne. Let's go back to 1595. His father, Murad III, was not just a prolific ruler, he was prolific in every sense of the word. Historical records, including those of the court chronicler Selanik'i Mustafa Effendi, indicate Murad III fathered somewhere between 20 and 40 sons from his extensive harem. 19 of those sons were alive when he died. 19 brothers, 19 potential challengers, 19 men whose mere existence was a structural threat to the new Sultan's authority. Mehmed III wasted no time. The executions were carried out by the Bostances, the palace gardeners who doubled as executioners, and the royal mutes, men who had been purposely rendered deaf and mute since childhood so they could never testify about what they witnessed inside the palace walls. Silk cords, not blades. The bodies would show no wounds, no blood on imperial floors. It was clinical, it was organized, it was terrifying in its efficiency. But here is the detail that makes this story not just dark history, but genuinely haunting. The mothers were still alive. The Ottoman harem was not just a collection of concubines, it was a complex, politically charged social structure. These women had spent years cultivating relationships, building alliances, maneuvering for their sons' futures. And on this one night, every single one of them who had not produced the Sultan lost everything. Some accounts describe the mothers throwing themselves before the executioners. Others describe them bribing guards, pleading with the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, to intervene. The grief inside the harem that night must have been incomprehensible. And then, in a detail that the court chronicler Selanik'i records with almost clinical coldness, the 19 bodies were washed, wrapped, and buried with full Islamic rites. The empire that killed them also mourned them, properly, officially. The hypocrisy is staggering, and the empire apparently felt no contradiction in it at all. This raises the deepest, most uncomfortable question at the heart of this entire story. How did an Islamic empire, an empire that claimed to represent the highest ideals of the faith, led by men who styled themselves as caliphs and servants of God, justify murdering children? The answer is complicated and deeply revealing about the way power shapes morality. The Ottoman religious and legal establishment, the ulema, didn't simply stay silent. Some of them actively provided theological cover. The argument was built around a concept in Islamic jurisprudence called maslaha, public interest or necessity. The idea that when individual harm is weighed against collective catastrophe, the collective must take precedence. In the logic of the Ottoman state, one dead prince was infinitely preferable to a civil war that could kill thousands. The math of empire made fratricide not just permissible but arguably righteous. There were scholars who objected quietly. The argument was never universally accepted, but the sultans didn't need universal acceptance, they needed enough institutional cover to proceed, and they got it. What this reveals about Mehmed II and every sultan who followed his law is something deeply psychologically complex. These were not simply monsters, they were men who had internalized a specific brutal logic of statecraft. Men who understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that the empire they commanded was not just a kingdom. It was a civilization of millions, a geopolitical force that balanced the entire world order of its time. And they had convinced themselves that no price was too high to maintain it. That conviction doesn't make what they did less monstrous, but it does make it more understandable, and somehow that makes it more disturbing. Here is the great historical irony of the fratricide law. The very system designed to guarantee stability eventually became one of the reasons the Ottoman Empire began to decline. Because here is what happens when you lock every potential heir in a cage for decades, deny them governance experience, surround them with yes men and flatterers, cut them off from the real world, and then suddenly hand them the most powerful throne on earth. You get sultans who have no idea how to rule. Ibrahim the Mad, Mustafa I, deposed twice for mental instability. Mehmed IV, who came to power as a child and presided over the disastrous siege of Vienna in 1683. The later Ottoman Sultans who ruled as puppets while their mothers, Grand Viziers, and Janissary commanders made the real decisions. The Sultanate of Women. The era of Grand Viziers who held more power than the emperors themselves. The Janissary Corps who regularly deposed sultans they found inconvenient. All of it traces back, in part, to a succession system that prioritized eliminating threats over producing capable rulers. The fratricide law was a solution to one problem that quietly created another. It kept the empire unified and slowly hollowed it out from the inside. By the 17th century, the Ottomans had actually abandoned formal fratricide. The Kafes system replaced mass execution. Princes were imprisoned rather than killed, which solved the image problem but created the psychological devastation problem instead. It was a different kind of destruction, and arguably a slower one. The empire chose cruelty and got instability anyway, just on a longer timeline. Mehmed II wrote his fratricide law to build an eternal empire. He built one of the greatest empires in human history, no question. The Ottoman state endured for over 6 centuries, outlasting virtually every rival civilization of its era. By almost any historical metric, the system worked. But here is what lingers. Every sultan who sat on that throne, from the triumphant Suleiman, the magnificent to the broken Ibrahim, The mat sat on a foundation built from the bones of their brothers. Every expansion, every architectural marvel, every legal reform, every golden age of the empire, all of it was financed, in a very real sense, by institutionalized murder within the family that claimed to represent God on earth. The empire justified it as necessity. History records it as law. But somewhere in the Topkapi Palace, in the tombs near the Hagia Sophia, where those 19 brothers of Mehmed III are buried, there are names that most people will never read. Boys who had no choice in where they were born, no vote in who their father was, and no escape from what that meant. They were not traitors. They were not rebels. They were simply brothers. And the law said that was enough. The Ottoman Empire built its immortality on their silence. If this story reached something inside you, the kind of history that doesn't just inform you but genuinely disturbs you, then Empireon is exactly where you belong. Subscribe, because we're just getting started.